Again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today, we're sifting through clues and signs and hints, trying to get to the heart of a mysterious ancient teaching, a teaching that remains to a great extent a question mark, despite the fact that it's shaped our thinking for more than 2 millennia without many of us even being aware of it. Sounds a bit like something from a Dan Brown novel, doesn't it? And yet, there's nothing fictitious about this. I'm talking about the school of thought launched by Plato in the 4th century BC, a philosophy that probably more than any other has made Western culture what it is, even though it, like much philosophy really, has remained essentially unknown by most of the population since that time, and even though there seems little consensus among those who study it most closely today about what lies at its heart. It's to this question of what's at the core of Plato's philosophy, the principle or principles of it, that our search to understand Platonic love has taken us, because we can't understand Plato's theory of love without understanding what he saw as the ultimate object of love, the good. And as we saw last time, it's the view of at least some scholars that Plato understood the good as the unity of being in its absolute oneness, as opposed to this cosmos and this existence of ours that we mundanely take to be a multitude of objects and moments. As I've said, Plato doesn't actually say this in any of the dialogues that have come down to us. But the advocates of this view that I'm talking about, known as the Tübingen school, after the university in which it was first really elaborated, beginning in the 1950s, say there's lots of evidence that points to this conclusion anyway. And that's what we'll be looking at today. The Tübingen Plato is probably not quite the Plato you know, especially if you learned about Plato from an English-speaking professor, I think. This is a much more arcane, even more mystical Plato that tends to be taught in most universities today, I think especially Anglo-American ones. A Plato whose entire philosophy depends on a doctrine barely capable of being expressed in words, known in his day only to a few, possibly even kept secret from those outside his school. I think it also paints the picture of a much more mysterious Plato, because whether it's true or not, it shows that there's at the very least an unresolved question at the very heart of his philosophy. To most people familiar with Plato today, especially, but not only in the English-speaking world, his philosophy is above all the forms, these ideal realities that serve as the patterns of things. And certainly they're one of the dominant themes of Plato's written works, the dialogues. The problem with this view of Plato, Tübingen scholars say, is that it leaves a number of mysteries unsolved, including some startling things that Plato seems to have written about himself and that his former student Aristotle and a number of ancient authors wrote about his teaching. So I could have called this episode Unsolved Mysteries. It's worth noting that there's variety within the Tübingen interpretation, as it's not exactly the same, of course, from scholar to scholar. It's not uniform. So what I'm going to tell you is really a broad summary, an attempt to summarize. But basically, the Tübingen school contends that more important to Plato than the theories he wrote about in his dialogues was a set of unwritten or esoteric doctrines known only to him and the tight circle of students at his Athens school, the academy, not intended for those outside its walls. Hence the term esoteric, which comes from a Greek word translatable as more within. These teachings were not necessarily secret, but they were, these scholars argue, not meant for the broader public, and they were never written down. At least, the theory goes, they don't appear explicitly in the dialogues, though they're certainly hinted at, and the entire Platonic philosophy, as expressed in the dialogues, the argument goes, is built on them and can only be fully understood in light of them. Plato's esoteric doctrines comprise, for followers of the Tübingen interpretation, a kind of mathematical metaphysics, or perhaps, put better, perhaps even a mathematical mysticism. The forms can ultimately all be explained in numerical terms, and all number can in turn be explained with recourse to two principles known as the one and the indefinite dyad, also known as the dyad of the great and the small. The one is the principle of unity and order, and as such is really the same as the good. The indefinite dyad is the principle of multiplicity and chaos. Some proponents of the Tübingen interpretation see these two principles in turn as reducible in some way to a single principle, the one. And after all, the one is really the principle of all number, right? It's the basic building block of number. So reducible into a single principle, the one, and they say for Plato, knowledge of the one is not communicable really, or hardly communicable, which is, as we saw, what Plato also said about the good in the Republic. So where do they get this idea of Plato's teachings? I have time for only a thumbnail sketch of the evidence here, and I think it'll even so end up being a longer video than most. But I think it's fair to say that it really starts with Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. In his book, The Physics, Aristotle, whose scholars believed studied under Plato for 20 years, refers in passing to his former teacher's agrapha dogmata, or unwritten doctrines. Aristotle's talking about what Plato wrote about matter, space, and this idea of things imitating or participating in their ideal forms in his dialogue, the Timaeus. And Aristotle, writes, quote, "It is true indeed that the account he gives there in the Timaeus of the participant is different from what he says in his so-called unwritten teaching," unquote. Aristotle doesn't pause to explain what he means by this term, as though his readers, or I guess better, hearers, since actually the works of Aristotle that have come down to us are mostly thought to have been lecture notes for use at his own school that he founded after he left the academy, the Lyceum. And so he speaks as though his listeners were already aware of the existence of these unwritten doctrines. He doesn't seem to feel any need to explain what he's talking about. More significantly, though, I think, in a particularly cryptic passage of his Metaphysics, Aristotle briefly summarizes Plato's philosophy in a way that anyone whose knowledge of Plato comes only from the dialogues is likely to find mystifying. Beginning with the claim that Plato saw his eternal unchanging forms as composed of elements. And Aristotle wrote, quote, "Since the forms are the causes of all other things, he thought their elements were the elements of all things," Aristotle wrote. The forms, Aristotle continues, in Plato's view, have as their elements or principles the indefinite dyad and the one, because the forms are reducible to numbers, and numbers in turn come out to be a sort of interaction of the dyad and the one. Because the dyad is a mathematical chaos or a kind of matter on which the one acts or is in some way drawn upon to produce number and thereby order or essence or substance. The Greek word ousia means both essence and substance. So Aristotle writes, quote, "As matter, the great and the small," for Plato, "were principles. As substance or essence, the one. For from the great and the small, by participation in the one, come the numbers." So I think when he uses the word matter here, he doesn't really mean I don't think physical stuff that we can touch, but rather a sort of indefiniteness that unity gives form to. So I'll just repeat what he said. As matter, the great and the small were principles. As substance, or essence, the one was a principle. For from the great and the small, by participation in the one, come the numbers. Moreover, Aristotle continues, the one and the dyad, this mathematical chaos, the cause or principle of indefiniteness, lie for Plato at the heart of what's right and wrong. Plato, he writes, saw the one as the cause of good and the indefinite dyad as the cause of evil, presumably as the principles, as we said, of order and chaos in the universe, and presumably in the human heart. We skip over a lot here and move on to another interesting fact. A student of Aristotle, Aristoxenus of Tarentum, related in a book about music, the Elementa Harmonica, that Aristotle had a habit of telling a certain anecdote about Plato. Once, Aristotle would say, Plato decided to give a public lecture outside the walls of the academy on the good. But the lecture went badly, the story goes, because Plato's listeners had significantly more conventional ideas about the good than he did, and they had no idea what they were walking into. They had no idea that his teachings were underlain ultimately by mathematical principles, the principle of unity, most of all. And they basically were unable to process this, or at least they weren't buying it when Plato tried to explain it to them. So Aristoxenus writes, they all came, Aristotle said, supposing that they were going to acquire one of the things which people commonly consider good, such as wealth, health, strength, in general, some astounding happiness or other. But when the discourse turned out to be about the mathematical sciences, about numbers and geometry and astronomy, and its conclusion to be that the good is one, it seemed to them, I imagine, altogether contrary to their expectations, so that some of them belittled it while others found fault. So the obvious question, I guess, at this point is, if Plato had these doctrines at the heart of his philosophy, why don't they appear in the dialogues explicitly? Why did he have unwritten teachings? One possibility, of course, is that, assuming the anecdote from Aristoxenus is true, he may have felt that this episode showed him that most people just weren't able to handle these teachings. They were too strange for people to accept. And indeed, we see in Plato's Republic, especially Book 6, Socrates voicing a lot of anxiety about philosophers being deeply misunderstood by most people, partly because of how widespread human folly is. In this, you might remember in Book 6, the parable of the ship and the pilot, for example. And in the famous story of the cave, he talks about the danger that the philosopher who has seen the sun, the good, returning down into the cave to try to explain this other world to those who are still there. He writes, as for the man who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow lay their hands on him and kill him, they would do so. Of course, for Plato, there would have been the very real precedent of Socrates being put to death for his teaching. I'm sort of reminded at this point of that movie, The Thin Red Line, where there was one soldier who claims to have seen a whole other world, and that claim is met with scoffing by his commanding officer. Anyway, so human stupidity, and I think this kind of mob mentality for Plato is part of the problem. There's also the difficulty of the subject matter itself. The highest wisdom makes it hard for philosophers to put in any sort of language. Remember, Socrates in Book 6 agrees to talk about the good only a limited way and with great reluctance, for fear he'll come off as ridiculous. Another passage frequently cited by the Tübingen school as an explanation for Plato's reticence is found in a dialogue called the Phaedrus, which we'll certainly turn to in more detail later in this series. And this is interesting, and it can be a bit hard to process, because after a famously beautiful discussion of eros, the second most important one in Plato's writings, after that in the Symposium that we've been talking so much about, Socrates rather suddenly launches into a sharp criticism of the value of the written word, especially for communicating serious and important things. And so I think it poses a special problem for all of us, but I wonder if it poses it poses a problem for all of us, but I wonder if it poses a particular problem for those of us who are in the tradition, who are either sort of we call people of the book, or are in the tradition that we have this heritage of being people of the book. It's part of our spiritual background, and I think a lot of our unconscious assumptions lie in these text-based religions, I guess primarily Christians and Jews and Muslims. So his point isn't that written materials are worthless, though. But what he's saying is that the understanding of true philosophers is always deeper than what they've actually written. The knowledge of the true philosopher, Socrates argues, goes far beyond what he's actually written down. And those who have nothing more valuable to offer than what they have written down don't deserve to be called philosophers. So this expresses his views on teaching and writing in a kind of general and impersonal way. There's another text that addresses the same topic, but much more strikingly, though it poses a different sort of problem. It might not actually have been written by Plato. You may or may not know that although the dialogues are certainly the writings that Plato is most famous for, there's also a stack of 13 letters that have traditionally been attributed to him. But some or all of them seem to have actually been written by other writers at or after the time of Plato, probably as a kind of homage, not what we would call plagiarism, or at least not out of any sort of nefarious motive, probably. Anyway, as to the current status of scholarly opinion on this, I quote Robin Waterfield, author of the 2023 biography of Plato called Plato of Athens. He says, "The authenticity of any of Plato's letters is one of the most hotly contested issues in Platonic scholarship. It is one of those issues that is subject to scholarly fashion. At the moment, the scholarly consensus, while falling well short of unanimity, is that even the most plausible of them are forgeries. But in the middle of the 20th century, the consensus was the other way around, and there are signs that the pendulum is swinging back again." So we have here, in a way, it seems to me, something like a definite maybe from the Academy on the authenticity of at least some of these letters. Waterfield himself believes some of them were actually written by Plato, and among these he places the seventh one. Strikingly, as I said, if not, maybe not even astonishingly, partway through this long letter, the seventh, the author, either Plato or someone claiming to be Plato, explicitly denies ever having written and even having the intention to ever write about the heart of his teaching, which is the knowledge of something ineffable, yet somehow certain, a knowledge that he feels is aptly figured by the dramatic image of a fire blazing up from a single spark. At a certain point in the letter, he mentions other people trying to set down his own teaching in their written work. And then he suddenly says, "One statement at any rate I can make in regard to all who have written or who may write with a claim to knowledge of the subjects to which I devote myself, no matter how they pretend to have acquired it, whether from my instruction or from others, or by their own discovery. Such writers can, in my opinion, have no real acquaintance with the subject. I certainly have composed no work in regard to it, nor shall I ever do so in future. For there's no way of putting it in words like other studies. Acquaintance with it must come rather after a long period of attendance on instruction in the subject itself, and of close companionship, when suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, it is generated in the soul, and at once becomes self-sustaining. Besides, this at any rate I know, that if there were to be a treatise or a lecture on this subject, I could do it best. I'm also sure, for that matter, that I should be very sorry to see such a treatise poorly written. If I thought it possible to deal adequately with the subject in a treatise or a lecture for the general public, what finer achievement would there have been in my life than to write a work of great benefit to mankind and to bring the nature of things to light for all men? I do not, however, think the attempt to tell mankind of these matters a good thing, except in the case of some few who are capable of discovering the truth for themselves with a little guidance. In the case of the rest, to do so would excite in some an unjustified contempt in a thoroughly offensive fashion, in others certain lofty and vain hopes, as if they had acquired some awesome lore. He seems to be kind of suggesting that the truth at the heart of his philosophy is a kind of humble one in a way. Anyway, Plato, or whoever the real author of this letter is, then goes into a fascinating discussion of the difficulty of conveying reality through words before concluding, for this reason, no serious man will ever think of writing about serious realities for the general public, so as to make them a prey to envy and perplexity. So there's a passage that would seem to be almost a clincher for anyone arguing that Plato's most important teachings aren't likely to be found in the dialogues, except that we don't know, and I guess probably never will know with certainty, whether it was actually written by Plato. But I do think that even though, in a way, it can be startling for us now in the 21st century to read this, these thoughts would certainly not have been unusual in Plato's time. Many ancient sages avoided setting their thoughts down in writing. They simply didn't share our modern assumption, and that I think, many of us probably inherit from our background as people of the book, or people of the book, with this in our background, that wisdom ought to be disseminated as widely as possible. There was often in the ancient world a certain kinship between philosophical schools and secret mystery cults. We see this with the Pythagoreans, for example, and in fact, no writings of Pythagoras have come down to us today, possibly because he never committed any of his teaching to writing. Some ancient philosophers who did, Parmenides, for example, wrote notoriously cryptically. We learn from Porphyry, the student of the 3rd century AD philosopher Plotinus, that Plotinus and 2 other students of the philosopher Ammonius Saccas actually made a vow not to disclose any of his teachings to others. It seems this vow was gradually broken, and eventually Plotinus began to write down the things he had said in his seminars. But even then, Porphyry says, these writings were shared with a select and carefully vetted few. It's interesting that Porphyry never seems to feel it necessary to even explain why they felt they should keep these teachings a secret. He just expects his readers to understand. Anyway, I'm going to have to come to a stop here simply because neither I nor you guys, I'm sure, have all day. I'm aware this has turned into a bit of a marathon session, but anyway, these are the main arguments as I see them for why the Tübingen school believes Plato taught that the one, the unity of being, is identical to the good, even though this doesn't appear explicitly in the dialogues. And so to take this all back to our scene at the drinking party, the symposium. If this is true, then if we are to understand what Plato means by the good here, it seems that what Diotima is saying is that at the heart of eros is desire for oneness on the most basic existential level, a oneness that language can never really capture. So obviously a lot to unpack there, I think, but we'll be getting into it in more detail later in this series. First, I'd like to linger a bit on this Tübingen theory, though, as I think I'd be remiss in not considering the case or cases against it. And that's what I'll be looking at next time. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.